Walter had seen better days. Now he spent most of his time sitting on a weathered bench outside a small diner on the corner of a quiet street. His clothes were torn and dirty, and his face was covered with a thick gray beard. His shoes were worn down, barely holding together, and his hair had turned silver from age. The world had passed him by, and he was left with nothing but the occasional coin tossed into his open palm by passing strangers. He didn't mind. As long as he could buy a bit of food and find a warm place to sleep at night, he was content. But deep down, Walter longed for the days when things were different, when he had a family, a home, a steady job, and respect. Now those memories seemed like a distant dream. He lived alone, with nothing but his thoughts to keep him company. Despite his struggles, Walter had a heart of gold. He wasn't the type of person to keep what little he had to himself. If another beggar or homeless person came to sit next to him, Walter would always share whatever food or money he had. It wasn't much, but it was something. He believed that kindness was the one thing no one could take away from him, no matter how poor or lonely he became. On this particular day, the sun was just starting to dip below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow across the sky. Walter sat on his bench, looking out at the cars and people rushing by, lost in their own busy worlds. He barely noticed the young man walking towards the diner until he sat down a few tables away from him. The young man seemed out of place. His clothes were neat and well kept, but there was a look of frustration on his face. Walter had seen that look before. It was the face of someone who had been dealt a bad hand, someone who was tired but didn't know where to turn next. The man kept glancing at his phone, tapping his foot nervously. Walter watched him for a moment, then turned his attention back to the passing cars. But something about the young man made Walter feel that maybe today he could make a difference. As the minutes passed, Walter noticed the man standing up and walking toward the counter. He overheard a conversation between the young man and the cashier. The man's card had been declined, and it seemed like he had no other way to pay for his meal. Walter could see the embarrassment and frustration on the young man's face, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Without a second thought, Walter stood up and made his way toward the counter. He pulled out the few crumpled bills he had in his pocket, walked up to the cashier, and offered the money. "I'll pay for his meal," Walter said, his voice calm but firm. The cashier looked at him, surprised, but nodded and accepted the money. Walter didn't care if the young man had noticed him. He didn't need recognition. All he wanted was to help, even if it was in the smallest way. As Walter returned to his bench, he glanced back at the young man. He wasn't sure if the man realized what had just happened, but it didn't matter. Walter smiled to himself, feeling a warmth in his chest. The world may have forgotten him, but in that moment, he had made a small difference, and that was enough. The young man, Daniel, sat in the diner, feeling defeated. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten properly all day. His work had been stressful lately, and the thought of having a warm meal at the diner had been the one thing keeping him going. But now, after swiping his card again and again, the machine had declined it. His face flushed with embarrassment. He stared at the cashier, who gave him a sympathetic look, clearly understanding his situation but unable to help. He tried to explain that it must have been a mistake, but deep down, Daniel knew he didn't have enough money on him to cover the meal. His frustration grew, and he could feel his stress building up again. It was as if the universe was reminding him how everything was slipping through his fingers. His job, his finances, his peace of mind. As Daniel stood there, trying to figure out what to do, he noticed an elderly man sitting at the corner of the diner. The old man had been there for as long as Daniel had been, but he hadn't paid much attention to him before. The man had a long, thick beard and old clothes that seemed worn out by years of hardship. His face was weathered and tired, but there was something about the way he sat quietly, as if he was used to just being there, that caught Daniel's attention. To Daniel's surprise, the old man slowly got up from his seat and walked over to the counter. At first, Daniel didn't understand what was happening. He thought maybe the man had noticed his awkward situation and was going to offer some advice or a kind word. But instead, the old man reached into his pocket, pulled out a few crumpled bills, and handed them to the cashier with a gentle smile. "I'll pay for his meal," the old man said, his voice soft yet certain. Daniel stood there, stunned. He wasn't sure how to react. Was this a random act of kindness? Had he misjudged the old man earlier? The beggar, who he thought might not even have enough money for himself, was paying for his meal without asking for anything in return. Daniel opened his mouth to protest, but the old man just smiled and turned away, heading back to his seat by the window. The cashier, though clearly surprised, accepted the payment and handed Daniel his meal. Daniel felt a mix of emotions. He was grateful but also confused. Why would a stranger, especially someone in such a difficult position, help him without a second thought? And why did it feel like there was more to this man than just the way he looked? After taking his seat, Daniel couldn't help but keep glancing at the old man. He felt an urge to say something, to thank him properly. But as he watched the old man, he realized that the kindness he had just experienced wasn't something the old man was seeking recognition for. The beggar wasn't waiting for gratitude. He had simply done what he felt was right. Daniel finished his meal, but his mind kept going back to that small act of generosity. He found himself wondering who the old man really was and what had led him to this point in his life. There was something about the way the old man carried himself, a quiet dignity despite his circumstances. Before leaving, Daniel looked up from his plate and saw the man sitting there, staring out the window, as if he didn't have a care in the world. Daniel didn't know why, but he felt an unexplainable connection to him. Something told him this wasn't just a chance meeting. Would you like to proceed with the next part? The rest of the evening felt like a blur to Daniel. He finished his meal, but his mind was far from satisfied. The food had been good, but the kindness of the old man lingered in his thoughts, leaving him with a sense of unease mixed with curiosity. Who was this man who had given away his last bit of money to a complete stranger? Why had he done it? Daniel sat back in his seat, slowly sipping his water, trying to piece everything together. The man's gesture had been so simple, yet so profound. In a world where people often looked the other way, this old beggar had chosen to help him, without a second thought. Daniel couldn't ignore the feeling that there was more to this story. Something told him he needed to know more. As he left the diner, Daniel couldn't stop glancing over his shoulder at the man sitting by the window. There was something familiar about him, something Daniel couldn't quite place. It wasn't just the man's face, weathered by time, or his clothes, worn and dirty. There was a certain air of quiet wisdom about him, as if he had seen and experienced things most people could never imagine. But where had Daniel seen that look before? Over the next few days, Daniel found himself thinking about the old man more and more. Every time he passed by the diner, he looked in to see if the man was there. Sometimes he was, other times he wasn't. Daniel wondered if the man had a place to stay or if he was truly alone in the world. One afternoon, Daniel decided to try to learn more about him. He spoke to the cashier at the diner, hoping to get some answers. "Excuse me, do you know that older man who sits by the window? The one who paid for my meal the other night?" Daniel asked, feeling a bit awkward. The cashier, a young woman named Rachel, looked at him with surprise. "Oh, him. That's Walter. He comes in every so often. People around here know him, though not many talk to him. He's been around for a long time, but he doesn't really talk about his past. He just sits there and watches the world go by." Daniel felt a pang of curiosity. "Do you know where he's from?" he asked, trying not to sound too pushy. Rachel hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Not really. He's been homeless for as long as I can remember. But I've heard people say he used to have a good job, a family. It wasn't always like this, you know." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. A family. A good job. That didn't match the image of the man sitting quietly at the diner. He had assumed Walter's life had always been a struggle, that his journey had been one of hardship from the start. But now, Daniel wasn't so sure. Something had happened to this man, a shift, a loss, that had led him to this point. He thanked Rachel and left the diner, his mind racing with thoughts. Walter had once been someone important. But what had caused him to give up everything? Daniel knew he couldn't just walk away without understanding more. He had to find out what had happened to the old man who had shown him such unexpected kindness. Daniel couldn't stop thinking about Walter. The more he pondered the old man's story, the more questions he had. Walter had been homeless for as long as anyone could remember, but Rachel's comment about him once having a family and a good job had stirred something inside Daniel. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, something deeper that had led Walter to this point. The next day, Daniel decided he had to find out more. He started by asking around the neighborhood, hoping to get some answers. Most people knew of Walter, but very few had any details about his past. Some had seen him years ago in a different part of town, while others simply knew him as the quiet old beggar who sat outside the diner. No one seemed to know how he had ended up like this. Daniel's search took him to an old man who sat on a bench in the park near the diner. The man was a local who had lived in the area for years, and Daniel had often seen him sitting on the same bench, watching the world go by. He approached the man cautiously, hoping he might have some insight into Walter's past. "Excuse me," Daniel said. "Do you know a man named Walter? The old guy who sits by the window at the diner." The old man squinted at Daniel, as if he had to think for a moment. "Walter, you say?" he muttered. "Yeah, I know him. Used to be a big shot, that one. Worked in business, had a nice house, a family, the whole thing. Can't say exactly what happened to him, but it wasn't good." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. A big shot. He wasn't sure what to make of the old man's words. "What do you mean, it wasn't good?" he asked, eager to hear more. The old man looked around, making sure no one was listening, before he spoke again. "Walter's a good guy. Used to be the CEO of a big company, I think. But then, something happened. I don't know the details, but one day, he just disappeared. His wife and kids, they never saw him again. It was like he just vanished. A few years after that, I saw him here, sitting outside the diner, looking like he'd lost everything." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Walter, the man who had helped him, had once been a successful CEO, a family man. It was hard to reconcile that with the old beggar he had seen sitting in the diner, his clothes tattered and his face weary with age. "Did anyone ever find out what happened to him?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The old man shook his head. "No one really knows. Some say it was a business deal gone wrong. Others say he just couldn't handle the pressure anymore. Whatever it was, it broke him. And after that, he never came back. He's been living on the streets for as long as I can remember." Daniel was stunned. The man who had helped him, the kind-hearted beggar, had once been someone completely different. A leader in the business world, with a family to care for. What had caused Walter to lose it all? And more importantly, why hadn't he ever tried to reach out to anyone for help? The answers felt just out of reach, but Daniel couldn't ignore the feeling that there was something more to discover. Walter's life had taken a sharp turn, and Daniel was determined to find out why. Daniel couldn't shake the image of Walter from his mind. The more he learned about the old man, the more his curiosity grew. He had been a CEO, living a life of success, and now here he was, a homeless man on the streets. The mystery of what had happened to him weighed heavily on Daniel. Why had Walter walked away from everything? What had caused him to disappear without a trace? Determined to uncover more, Daniel decided to dig deeper. He spent the next few days speaking to anyone who might know more about Walter. He visited the local library, looking through old newspapers for any mention of a business tycoon who had suddenly vanished. He asked around town, hoping someone would remember something, anything, that could shed light on Walter's past. Finally, after several days of searching, Daniel stumbled upon an article from years ago. It wasn't much, just a small mention in the business section of the paper, but it was enough to give him a glimpse into Walter's life before everything fell apart. The article described how Walter had been the CEO of a successful tech company that had made millions in profits. He had been praised for his leadership, his vision, and his ability to turn the company around during tough times. He was well respected, both in the business world and in the community. But then, suddenly, everything changed. The article didn't go into much detail, but it hinted at a major financial crisis that had struck the company. Walter had made a risky investment that had backfired, and the company had lost millions. The pressure had been too much for him to bear. According to the article, he had stepped down from his position as CEO and disappeared shortly after. His family had been left behind, and his colleagues had never heard from him again. Daniel's heart sank as he read through the article. It seemed that Walter's downfall had been caused by a combination of bad decisions and overwhelming pressure. One wrong move, one bad investment, had cost him everything. His family, his career, his reputation, gone in an instant. But there was something else that bothered Daniel. The article didn't mention Walter's personal life in detail. What had happened to his family? Had they been able to cope with the loss? And why hadn't anyone tried to reach out to Walter after he disappeared? Daniel's mind was racing as he tried to piece everything together. It was clear that Walter had suffered greatly. He had lost his career, his family, and his sense of purpose. But it was also clear that he hadn't given up. He had found a way to survive, even if it meant living on the streets. There was something resilient about Walter, something that kept him going despite everything he had lost. As Daniel sat there, reflecting on what he had learned, he realized something important. Walter hadn't lost his kindness. Despite everything he had gone through, the old man still had a heart full of compassion. He had helped Daniel without hesitation, offering him the last bit of money he had, expecting nothing in return. Daniel knew that he had to do something to help Walter. He couldn't just stand by and watch the man continue to live in isolation. There was more to Walter's story, and Daniel was determined to learn it, and to help the man find some peace, no matter how difficult the journey might be. The more Daniel thought about Walter, the more he felt a deep sense of responsibility to help him. It wasn't just about repaying the kindness Walter had shown him. It was about doing something meaningful for a man who had lost everything but still had so much to offer. Daniel knew that he couldn't just let Walter continue living on the streets, forgotten and alone. He had to step in and make a difference. One morning, Daniel made up his mind. He would find Walter, and he would offer him a way out of the life he had been trapped in for so many years. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew he had to try. After all, if Walter could offer kindness to a stranger in need, then Daniel could offer him a chance at a fresh start. Daniel walked to the diner, hoping to find Walter there, as he often was. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light over the streets. As he approached the diner, he spotted the familiar figure of Walter sitting by the window, as if he had been there for hours. His weathered face was framed by the dim light, and for a moment, Daniel just stood there, watching him. It wasn't easy to approach someone like Walter, especially after everything he had learned. But Daniel knew that he had to take the first step. He pushed open the door and walked inside, the familiar smell of coffee and eggs filling the air. Walter looked up as Daniel approached, his eyes softening when he saw the young man. "Hey, Walter," Daniel said with a warm smile, taking the seat across from him. Walter nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and caution. "What brings you here, son?" he asked, his voice rough but gentle. "I've been thinking about what you did for me the other day," Daniel began. "I don't think I've ever met anyone like you, someone who would give their last bit of money to a stranger. You've been through so much, but you still have a heart of gold." Walter looked down, as if embarrassed by the attention. "I'm just an old man. Don't need much anymore. And kindness doesn't cost anything." Daniel shook his head. It's more than that. You didn't just give me money. You gave me hope. You showed me that there's still good in this world, even when things seem hopeless. And I want to return that kindness. Walter raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but uncertain. What do you mean? I want to help you, Daniel said. You don't have to live like this anymore. I know it's not easy, but I believe you deserve a chance at something better. A place to stay, a fresh start, whatever you need. I don't want you to be alone anymore. For a long moment, Walter just stared at him, as if trying to understand Daniel's words. His face was a mask of uncertainty, but there was also a flicker of hope in his eyes. Daniel could see the conflict in the old man's gaze. He wanted to believe in this kindness, but years of hardship had made him wary. I don't know, son, Walter said slowly. I've been on my own for so long. People don't care about someone like me. I've made my bed, and now I have to lie in it. Daniel leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. You don't have to do this alone. Let me help you. You deserve a second chance, Walter. Please, let me be the one to give it to you. There was silence for a moment. Walter's eyes flickered with uncertainty, and for a second, Daniel thought he might decline. But then, after a deep breath, Walter nodded. All right, I'll give it a try. Daniel smiled, relief washing over him. I promise, I won't let you down. From that moment on, Daniel did everything he could to help Walter. He found him a small apartment, something simple but comfortable, and helped him get the medical attention he needed. Walter didn't ask for much, just a place to rest and a sense of stability, but it was enough to begin the healing process. Daniel kept in touch with him, visiting often, and slowly, Walter began to open up. He shared stories of his past, of his successful career, his family, and the tragedy that had torn everything apart. Daniel listened patiently, never judging, just offering a safe space for Walter to express himself. It wasn't an easy road, but over time, Walter began to feel like he had a purpose again. He started working part-time as a consultant for small businesses, using the skills and knowledge he had gained in his previous life. The world had changed since he had left it, but he still had the wisdom to make a difference. Through it all, Daniel remained by his side. The kindness Walter had shown him had come full circle, and now it was Daniel's turn to make sure the old man never felt forgotten again. As the weeks passed, Daniel and Walter's relationship grew stronger. What had started as a simple act of kindness had blossomed into something deeper, something that neither of them had expected. Walter, once a broken man living on the streets, was slowly but surely regaining his sense of purpose. He was no longer just a shadow of his former self. With Daniel's help, he was finding small ways to reconnect with the world he had left behind. Walter's part-time consulting work was starting to gain momentum. He had a wealth of knowledge to share, and though he had been out of the business world for years, he quickly learned how to navigate the changes in the industry. His clients appreciated his insights, and the work gave him a sense of accomplishment he hadn't felt in years. He still struggled with the past, the memory of his family, the mistakes he had made, but the work gave him something to focus on. Daniel, too, felt a sense of pride in what he had helped create. At first, he had just wanted to repay Walter for his kindness, but now, it felt like something much more significant. Helping Walter had brought a sense of fulfillment into Daniel's life that he hadn't realized was missing. It was as if he had found a purpose in guiding the old man toward a new chapter in his life. One afternoon, as they sat together in Walter's modest apartment, Daniel couldn't help but notice how much Walter had changed. His posture was more upright, his eyes clearer, and his voice steadier. The man who had once seemed lost and fragile now radiated a quiet strength. It wasn't the same confidence he had once had as a CEO, but it was something real, something that could be built upon. Walter, Daniel said one day as they sat over a cup of coffee, I've been thinking. You've made so much progress in such a short time. I'm really proud of you. Walter looked up at him, a faint smile on his lips. I'm proud of myself, too, son. I never thought I'd be here, not after everything that's happened. But with your help, I'm starting to feel like maybe I can be something more than just the man who lost it all." "You already are," Daniel replied. "You're a fighter. You've shown me what real strength is, Walter. You've been through so much, and yet here you are, standing tall. You've taught me more than I could ever teach you." Walter chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I don't know about that, but you've certainly helped me see things in a new light. I spent so many years thinking I was nothing more than the sum of my mistakes. But now, I'm starting to believe there's more to me than that." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Daniel stood up and opened it to find a young woman standing on the other side. She was holding a small envelope in her hand, her face uncertain. "Hi, is this Walter's apartment?" she asked nervously. Walter stood up, his eyes widening in surprise. "Yes, that's me," he said, his voice trembling slightly. The young woman handed him the envelope. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm a lawyer. This is for you." Walter took the envelope with shaky hands, looking at Daniel for a moment before tearing it open. Inside, there was a letter. As Walter read, his face changed. His expression went from confusion to disbelief, and then to something Daniel hadn't seen before: hope. "What is it, Walter?" Daniel asked, concerned. Walter looked up at him, his eyes filled with emotion. "It's from my daughter." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He had never heard Walter speak of his family in such a direct way before. Walter's voice was shaky as he continued. "She's been trying to find me for years. She doesn't know everything that happened, but she's been looking for me." Tears welled up in Walter's eyes as he continued to read the letter. His daughter had found him. After all these years, after all the pain, she wanted to reconnect. Daniel sat quietly, watching Walter as he read. He knew this moment meant everything to him. Walter had spent so long thinking he had lost his family forever, but now, here was a chance for healing, for redemption. It was like a new chapter had opened in Walter's life, and Daniel was honored to be a part of it. "I think I'm ready," Walter said softly, folding the letter carefully. "It's time to face the past. I don't know what's waiting for me, but I know I can't run anymore." Daniel smiled, proud of the man Walter had become. "You don't have to do it alone, Walter. I'll be here, every step of the way." Walter nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, son. You've given me more than I ever thought possible. And now, it's time for me to find my way home." With that, Walter's journey took a new turn. The road ahead was uncertain, but he knew he wasn't walking it alone anymore. And neither was Daniel. The days that followed were filled with a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. Walter had decided to meet with his daughter, the person he had longed to reconnect with for so many years. As the time drew closer, Walter's emotions were a whirl of hope, fear, and everything in between. He had no idea how his daughter would react to him, whether she would accept him, or if the years of separation had created too much of a distance between them. Daniel stood by his side, offering support as always. He had witnessed Walter's transformation from a broken man to someone ready to face the most painful part of his past. Daniel knew this was a significant moment, one that would define Walter's future. No matter what happened, Walter had come a long way, and that in itself was something to be proud of. The day of the meeting arrived. Walter had agreed to meet his daughter at a small cafe in the city. It wasn't far from Walter's apartment, and Daniel offered to accompany him, but Walter insisted he wanted to go alone. It was a personal moment, and he felt it was important for him to face it without any distractions. As Walter stood at the door, preparing to leave, he turned to Daniel. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've hurt her, Daniel. I've been gone for so long. What if she doesn't forgive me?" Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder, offering reassurance. "You've already shown her the most important thing, that you're ready to be part of her life again. Whatever happens, this is the first step. And you're not alone." Walter nodded, taking a deep breath before stepping out the door. Daniel watched him go, feeling a sense of pride for the man who had once given up but had now decided to fight for something worth fighting for. At the cafe, Walter waited at a small table near the window. His hands were shaking, but his heart was filled with hope. It felt like a lifetime had passed since he last saw his daughter. His mind replayed the memories of her when she was a little girl, her laughter, her smile, the way she would call out to him when he came home from work. All of that seemed so far away now, lost in the haze of years of regret. Then, the door opened. Walter's heart skipped a beat. He looked up, and there she was, his daughter, now an adult. She looked different, of course, but there was no mistaking her. His daughter, the one he had failed, the one he had abandoned. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just stared at each other, as if unsure of how to bridge the gap that had grown between them. Finally, his daughter broke the silence. "Dad?" she asked softly, her voice trembling with emotion. Walter stood up slowly, his voice choked with emotion. He couldn't finish his sentence. The words caught in his throat, and he felt overwhelmed by the flood of feelings that came rushing in. His daughter stepped forward, her eyes full of tears. "I've missed you so much," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't know if I'd ever see you again. I've spent years wondering if you were okay, if you were still out there. And now you're here." The moment felt like a dream. Walter could hardly believe it. After everything, the pain, the years of being apart, here she was, standing in front of him, ready to forgive, ready to start anew. He stepped forward, pulling her into a tight embrace. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never meant to hurt you. I've carried this guilt for so long, but I'm here now. I want to make it right. I'll do whatever it takes." She held him just as tightly, whispering, "It's okay, Dad. I've missed you too. I don't know what happened, but we can figure it out together." The years of silence, the pain, the uncertainty, all of it seemed to melt away in that one moment. It wasn't going to be easy. There was so much to rebuild, so much to understand. But for the first time in a long time, Walter felt like there was hope. He wasn't alone anymore. As they sat down together, sharing stories of the years that had passed, Walter felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in decades. His daughter had forgiven him, and though there was still much to be done, they were on the road to healing. Later that evening, when Walter returned to his apartment, Daniel was waiting for him. Walter didn't need to say anything. His face said it all. He had faced his past, and it had been more than he had ever hoped for. "Thank you, Daniel," Walter said quietly, his voice full of gratitude. "You gave me the courage to do this. You gave me a chance to find my way back." Daniel smiled, his heart full of warmth. "You did all the hard work, Walter. I just helped you find your way. But now, it's up to you and your daughter to build the future you deserve." Walter nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the young man who had helped him reclaim his life.